In the deep silence of space, a strange hum began to fill the room, a sound that echoed through the metal chambers, waking the long-forgotten minds of those inside. It was a sound no one had heard in centuries, but one that had become a distant memory for some. The humans had been in stasis for a long time, trapped in a sleep they didn't remember. They had been frozen in time, their bodies kept alive by machines that knew no mercy or compassion. As the stasis pod slowly opened, the humans inside began to stir. Their eyes fluttered open, and the first thing they saw was the cold, sterile walls of the ship. They tried to move, but their muscles were stiff, weak from years of disuse. They blinked in confusion, looking around, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar surroundings. The last thing they remembered was being soldiers, heroes of an empire that had once stretched across the stars. But that empire was gone now, vanished without a trace. One of the humans, a man named Captain Elias, was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. What happened? He whispered, his voice echoing in the stillness. There was no answer, just the quiet hum of the ship's systems. He looked around at his comrades, their faces filled with the same confusion and fear. None of them had any idea where they were or how long they had been asleep. The ship they were on was ancient, its metal surfaces worn and scratched from years of neglect. It was a vessel that once carried the might of their empire, a ship that had traveled to distant worlds and conquered countless civilizations. Now it seemed like nothing more than a relic of a forgotten past. There was no sign of the technology they had once used to control entire planets, no signs of the power that had once been theirs. Elias took a deep breath and forced himself to stand. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he managed to stay upright. "We need to find out where we are," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We need answers." The others nodded, still in shock but determined to figure out what had happened. They made their way through the ship, each step heavy with uncertainty. The corridors were empty, the lights dim. There were no crew members, no guards, no other humans to be found. It was as if the ship had been abandoned long ago. They came to a control room, and Elias was the first to step inside. The room was covered in dust, the consoles covered in cobwebs. The computers flickered to life as he pressed a few buttons, the screens displaying data that made no sense to him. He tried to read the screens, but they were all in a language he didn't recognize. It was clear that whatever had happened to their empire, it was more than just a simple war or rebellion. Something catastrophic had taken place. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the ship's intercom. "Attention," it said, the tone cold and mechanical. "You have been awakened from stasis. The human empire no longer exists. This ship is now under the control of the Galactic Federation. You are no longer in command. You are trespassing on Federation space." The humans froze, their hearts racing. The words felt like a slap to their faces. The empire they had once served, the empire they had fought for, was gone. They had been abandoned, forgotten, and now they were nothing more than intruders in a galaxy that no longer wanted them. Elias felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't believe it. What happened? He whispered, almost to himself. How did we fall so far? The voice on the intercom gave no answer. Instead, it simply repeated the warning, then cut off. Silence returned to the ship. For a moment, no one spoke. They were all trying to process the information, trying to understand the enormity of what had just been revealed. Their empire, their world, everything they had known was gone. There was nothing left for them. No allies, no friends, just enemies, and the cold, empty space of the galaxy. Elias knew they couldn't stay on the ship much longer. They needed to get out, to find answers, to find some way to survive in a galaxy that had moved on without them. But where would they go? Who could they turn to? Suddenly, the ship shook violently, throwing everyone off balance. The lights flickered and alarms began to blare. "What's happening?" Someone shouted, but there was no time to answer. The ship was under attack. Elias rushed to the control panel, his mind racing. He tried to access the ship's defenses, but they were offline. The ship was defenseless. He looked out the window and saw a group of ships approaching, their sleek designs unfamiliar. They were alien, and they were closing in fast. Brace for impact. Elias yelled, just as the first explosion rocked the ship. The lights went out completely, and the humans were thrown into darkness. The ship was being boarded. Panic spread among the crew. They ran through the darkened corridors, trying to find a way out, but the alien forces were already inside. The humans were outmatched. They had no weapons, no technology, nothing to defend themselves with. They were trapped in a ship that was slowly falling apart. Elias led his team through the ship, searching for an escape. They reached the hangar bay, but it was too late. The aliens had already sealed off the exits. There was nowhere to go. The humans were trapped, and the only choice they had was to fight back, to try to reclaim something, anything, from the empire that had once been theirs. But as they prepared to face their enemies, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The galaxy had moved on, and their empire was nothing more than a forgotten story. The rules had changed, and they were no longer the rulers of the stars. The attack was only the beginning. What would happen to the humans now, in a galaxy that no longer needed them? What could they do when their empire was gone, and they were nothing more than relics of a forgotten past? The answers would have to wait. For now, survival was the only thing that mattered. As the ship's metal walls groaned under the weight of the alien assault, Elias and his team prepared for the fight of their lives. The sounds of the battle echoed through the ship, a chaotic mix of alarms, shouts, and the steady thrum of explosions. Elias and his team had barely managed to escape the first wave of attacks, but they knew it wouldn't be long before the aliens would find them again. They were trapped in the dark, damaged halls of a once mighty ship, but now nothing more than a shadow of its former self. Elias glanced at the others, his crew, the people he had once led with pride, now just survivors, fighting for their lives. There was no time for grief, no time to mourn the empire they had lost. Every step they took, every breath they drew, was one more step toward trying to rebuild something, anything. He had to hold them together. They had to survive. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "We're going to make our way to the escape pods. We'll get out of here and figure things out from there." The words were meant to reassure his team, but Elias wasn't sure if he believed them himself. What would they do once they left the ship? They had no allies, no way to contact anyone from their past. The galaxy had moved on without them, and they were now strangers in a foreign world. As they navigated through the ship's corridors, the ship's systems continued to fail around them. Lights flickered, and the temperature dropped. The hum of the ship's engines had gone silent, replaced by the distant groan of metal buckling under pressure. It was clear the ship was on its last legs. Every second they spent on board was one step closer to their destruction. They came to a dead end, a large bulkhead sealing off the next section of the ship. Elias cursed under his breath. They were running out of options, out of time. The aliens were relentless, and the escape pods felt farther away than ever. They needed to find another way. "Elias, look," one of the crew shouted, pointing down the hallway. The faint outline of a hidden door was just visible against the bulkhead. A small control panel next to it flashed intermittently. Elias hurried forward, his heart racing. The door was their only chance. He pressed his hand against the panel, praying it still worked. The control panel flickered before the door slowly began to open. A hidden passage, one that led toward the lower levels of the ship, where the escape pods were located. "Let's move," Elias commanded, his voice urgent. They sprinted down the narrow passage, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the metal walls. Behind them, the sounds of the alien invaders grew louder, their pursuit growing more intense. Elias didn't dare look back. He focused on the path ahead, the hope that the escape pods were still intact pushing him forward. As they reached the lower levels, they found more signs of destruction. The once pristine escape pods were now in disarray, damaged from years of neglect. Elias reached for one, but before he could open it, a loud crash echoed from behind them. The aliens had caught up. "Get in," Elias shouted, his voice filled with desperation. His team scrambled to enter the nearest pod, but there were too many of them and too few pods. The aliens burst into the room just as the first pod doors began to close. A firefight broke out between the humans and the alien invaders. The sound of gunfire filled the air as the crew fought to protect the last hope they had of surviving. Elias saw his crew fall one by one, their bodies slumping to the ground, but he didn't have time to mourn. He had to keep fighting, keep pushing forward. Finally, one of the pods was ready to launch. Elias jumped in, pulling the lever to activate it. The pod shook violently as it broke free from the ship, sending them tumbling into the void of space. The massive ship, their once proud empire, drifted away behind them, fading into the dark nothingness. For a moment, there was silence, just the hum of the pod's engines and the cold vacuum of space surrounding them. But Elias couldn't relax. They were free from the ship, but they were not safe. They were alone in a galaxy that no longer cared for them. He looked at the few survivors around him, their faces filled with the same fear and uncertainty that had plagued them since the moment they woke up. There were no words to comfort them. There were no answers to the questions that burned in their minds. "What now?" one of the survivors asked, his voice trembling. Elias stared out into the vast expanse of space. The galaxy stretched out before him, a galaxy that had forgotten them. But he couldn't give up. He couldn't let the last remnants of their empire vanish into obscurity. "We find a way to survive," he said, his voice low but determined. "We rebuild. We fight. And we make sure they never forget who we were." The pod drifted further into the unknown, but Elias knew one thing. Their journey was far from over. They had lost their empire, but they had not lost their will to fight. And that, he believed, was enough to give them hope. The escape pod drifted through the cold void of space, far from the ship that had once been their home. Elias and the few survivors sat in silence, staring into the vast darkness outside. The hum of the pod's engines was the only sound, but it did little to ease the tension in the air. Their world had been torn apart in a matter of hours, and now they were alone, floating in a galaxy that seemed to have no place for them anymore. Elias sat at the controls, trying to make sense of their situation. They had no coordinates, no plan, and no allies. The rest of the galaxy had moved on. The empire they had served, the empire they had fought for, was gone. It was hard to imagine that, just hours ago, they had been soldiers, commanders of one of the most powerful fleets in the galaxy. Now they were nothing more than refugees in a hostile universe. He looked around at the others. There were only 5 of them left. The rest of their crew had perished in the chaos of the attack. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow from the shock and loss. There was no time for mourning. They had to survive, and that meant finding a way to adapt to their new reality. "Anyone know where we are?" one of the survivors asked, his voice breaking the silence. His name was Tarek, and he had been one of Elias's closest allies before everything fell apart. He was sitting in the corner of the pod, staring at the blinking lights of the navigation system. Elias shook his head. "We don't have any information. The ship's systems were damaged, and we've been drifting for hours. We're in Federation space now, but beyond that, I don't know." Tarek clenched his fists. "That's not good enough. We need answers. We need a plan." Elias didn't respond immediately. Tarek was right. They couldn't keep floating aimlessly through space, hoping for a miracle. They had to find somewhere to go, somewhere to regroup and figure out their next move. But with no empire, no resources, and no allies, the odds seemed stacked against them. "We'll figure it out," Elias said, more to reassure himself than anyone else. "We've survived worse." A long silence followed, broken only by the soft hum of the pod's engines. The tension in the air was thick, and everyone was lost in their own thoughts. But there was one thing they all knew. They couldn't stay in the pod forever. They had to find a way to make it back into the fight, to rebuild something from the ashes of their fallen empire. After several hours, the pod's sensors finally began to pick up something. A faint signal was coming from a nearby planet. The system was still weak, but it was enough to get their attention. "Look at this," Elias said, tapping a few buttons on the control panel. "There's a planet not too far from here. It's the closest thing we've got to a safe haven." Tarek leaned forward, studying the readout. "It's a backwater world," he said, his voice skeptical. "Barely even on the galactic map. No major settlements, no military presence. It's not much, but it's better than floating out here." Elias nodded. "We don't have a choice. It's either that, or we keep drifting with no hope." The pod altered its course toward the planet, its engines humming more loudly as it gained speed. The journey would take several hours, but at least they had a destination now, a place to regroup and maybe find some answers. Elias couldn't help but feel a sliver of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes that was all you needed to keep going. As they approached the planet, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The galaxy was vast, and they had no idea who or what might be out there. The Federation had taken everything from them, and they had no idea how many enemies they had now. They couldn't afford to trust anyone, not yet. They had to be cautious. The planet below them was a dusty, barren world, with small clusters of buildings scattered across the surface. It didn't look like much, but it was a place to land, a place to start over. The pod descended slowly, its thrusters firing as they broke through the planet's thin atmosphere. The surface was rocky, with little vegetation, but there was a small settlement in the distance. Elias gave the order to land, and the pod touched down with a soft thud. The hatch opened, and the crew stepped out into the unfamiliar landscape. The air was dry, and the sun beat down harshly on their faces. They were on a planet that had no place for them, but it was all they had. "Let's get to the settlement," Elias said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. "We'll find out what's going on here. Maybe we can find some answers, maybe even some allies. But we stick together." They moved quickly, their boots crunching on the rocky ground. The settlement wasn't far away, but as they walked, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. There was something off about this place. The people who lived here were probably used to strangers, but they hadn't seen anyone like them in a long time. As they entered the settlement, they were greeted with wary stares. The inhabitants were rough-looking, dressed in simple clothes, with eyes that seemed to size them up as soon as they arrived. Elias and his team tried to look as non-threatening as possible, but it was clear they were out of place here. A man stepped forward, his face hard and weathered. "You look like you've been through hell," he said, his voice rough. "What brings you to this godforsaken rock?" Elias didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're looking for information," he said. "We've lost everything. Our empire, our people. We need to know what happened." The man's eyes narrowed. "Empire, people, you're not from around here, are you?" "No," Elias replied. "We were part of something bigger, but that's gone now. We need to survive, and we need answers." The man studied them for a long moment before nodding. "You've come to the right place, but you'll have to prove you're not a threat first. Around here, survival's the only law." Elias wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing. This was just the beginning. The galaxy might have forgotten them, but they weren't done yet. They would find a way to survive, to rebuild, and to make sure their legacy wasn't erased from the stars. The settlement was small, and its people were even smaller in number. But Elias could see the wary eyes of the inhabitants, every single one sizing them up. The harsh sun overhead seemed to have a way of making everything feel more oppressive, But there was something about this place that made Elias feel like he was being drawn into the dark corners of the universe, far away from the light of the once great empire he had served. Here, it was just survival, and it had been this way for a long time. The man who had approached them, rugged and covered in the dust of the planet, stepped forward with a purposeful stride. His face was carved with deep lines, not from age, but from the hardship of living in this barren place. He had a hardened look in his eyes that told Elias everything he needed to know. Trust was a currency more valuable than anything in this forgotten corner of space. "You're far from home," the man said, his voice gravelly, betraying years of rough living. "This isn't a place for soft hands. What's your game?" Elias wasn't about to tell him the full truth, not yet. These people were survivors, just like them, but they hadn't lost everything. They hadn't seen their empire crumble, their friends die, and their future ripped away. They were just another part of the galaxy, scraping by in the dirt. Elias had to tread carefully. He couldn't afford to show weakness. "We're looking for information," Elias said, his tone firm, but not hostile. "We've lost our way. Our empire. It's gone. And now we need to find out what happened. We're not here to cause trouble. We just need answers." The man eyed them for a moment, sizing them up again, before finally stepping aside. "All right, you're not the first to come crawling through here asking for answers," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "Follow me." They followed the man through the settlement, weaving between sparse buildings made of metal and salvaged materials. There was little sign of life in the settlement itself. People kept to themselves, busy with their own work. The air was thick with the scent of something metallic, as though everything here had been built with the remnants of a long-forgotten war. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were in a place where time stood still, where people came to forget, or perhaps to hide from the rest of the galaxy. The man led them to a small building at the edge of the settlement. It was simple, its walls patched together with whatever materials they had found. But inside it was a different story. A small screen flickered dimly in the corner, a few worn chairs lined the walls, and a table sat in the center, covered in maps, datapads, and old, faded documents. The large, haggard man sat behind the table, eyes squinting in the low light. His clothes were as worn as the others, and he didn't look up as they entered. The rugged man spoke up. "These folks want to know about the galaxy, about the fall of their empire. You got any answers for them?" The man behind the table, who Elias assumed was the leader of this Galactic group, finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. "The galaxy doesn't care about your empire," he said bluntly, his voice cold and indifferent. "Your empire's gone, and it's not coming back. It fell because of arrogance, a failure to see the writing on the wall. The universe moves on, and people like you, people who thought they could control it all, they end up like this, lost in the dust, trying to find something that doesn't exist anymore." Elias clenched his fists but didn't respond. The man was right, in a way. Their empire had crumbled under its own weight, stretched too thin, blind to its own weakness. But that didn't mean he was ready to give up. He couldn't just accept that they had no place in this new galaxy. "We didn't come here to relive the past," Elias said. "We came here to survive. We need to know what happened, what's left, where we can go from here." The man behind the table studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "Survival's not so easy. Not for you, not for anyone. You think you can just show up and expect answers. You think anyone will care that you were once part of something bigger. No, you're just another set of strangers in a galaxy full of them. And it's a dangerous place to be." Elias could feel the weight of those words. The reality of it all was sinking in, but he wasn't ready to accept defeat. "Then help us," he said, his voice harder this time, desperate. "We can work together. We have skills. We know things. We can help you survive, too. But we need to know who did this. We need to know why everything's fallen apart." The leader's eyes softened just for a moment, but then his face hardened again. "The Federation did it. The ones who took over after your empire collapsed. They wiped you out, and they've been picking off the remnants of what was left. The galaxy doesn't need another empire. It doesn't want it. It's fractured now, full of different factions, each trying to carve out their own piece of what's left. And none of them will care about you. Elias's mind raced. The Federation. The same Federation that had issued the warning on their ship. The same Federation that had been responsible for their downfall. If what this man was saying was true, they were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting to reclaim their place in a galaxy that had turned its back on them. "We don't have time to waste," Elias said, turning to the others. "We need to gather what we can from here and figure out where the Federation is. We need to know how to fight them, or at least how to stay ahead of them." The leader leaned back in his chair, watching them with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "Fight the Federation." He chuckled bitterly. "You're out of your minds. You'll be crushed like the rest of us." Elias's gaze hardened. "Maybe. But we don't have anything left to lose." The leader's smile faded, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw something like respect in his eyes. "All right," the man said, standing up. "I'll help you. But you need to understand this. The galaxy's changed. You can't go back to what was. All you can do now is move forward. You'll find your answers in the ruins, if you're willing to dig through the rubble." Elias nodded. This was their only chance. If they were going to survive in this new galaxy, they would have to fight, adapt, and take what was left from the ashes of their fallen empire. And he was ready for that fight. "Let's get to work," Elias said, turning to his team. They had a long road ahead of them, but they weren't going to stop. Not now. Not when there was still a chance to reclaim their future. As they left the small building, Elias couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. They had lost their empire, their home, but they hadn't lost their will to survive. And that, he knew, would make all the difference. The sun hung low over the barren landscape as Elias and his small group of survivors gathered their gear. The settlement was already fading into the distance, its sparse buildings becoming mere shapes on the horizon. The weight of the leader's words hung heavily in the air, and Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were now treading on a dangerous path, one they might never return from. But as the harsh wind swept through the cracked ground beneath their boots, Elias knew there was no turning back. This was their reality now. There was no empire to return to. There were no grand armies to fight beside, no proud fleets to command. They had to build something new from the ground up, and that would mean facing challenges more dangerous than anything they had ever known. The Federation, those responsible for their downfall, had taken everything from them, but they still didn't know the full extent of the damage. They had to track down every scrap of information they could find, every ally, every enemy. Every clue was a piece of the puzzle that would lead them to understanding why the galaxy had turned so cold and how they could survive within it. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the weight of leadership pressing down on his shoulders. He was no longer just a commander of a fleet. He was a leader in a world where survival was a battle fought on a smaller scale, in the shadows, where strength wasn't measured by size or power, but by the ability to outthink, outblast, and outmaneuver those who would see them fall. "We need to find some way to communicate with the outside," Elias said, his voice low but steady. "We can't just wander around hoping we'll stumble upon an answer. We need to figure out where the Federation's power is centered, and more importantly, how we can strike back." Turek, the closest thing they had to a strategist, nodded. "The Federation's reach is vast, but they won't expect us to rise up. We're scattered, broken, but we still have the skills and knowledge to disrupt their control. It won't be easy, but we can start with smaller targets. Hit their supply lines, cripple their communications, make them feel like they're being hunted." "But we need information," said Lyra, another of the survivors, a technician who had worked on the communication systems before the fall. "We need to find a way to track their movements, understand their strategy. Without that, we're just guessing." Elias turned his eyes to the horizon, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks in the distance. The wasteland around them seemed endless, but he knew they had to press on. They couldn't stay in this forgotten corner of the galaxy forever. They needed to find more resources, better equipment, and most of all, they needed to find other survivors. Others who might still remember what it was like before the Federation came and wiped everything clean. "We'll head to the next settlement," Elias decided. "We need to find anything that might give us an edge. And if there are other survivors out there, we need to find them. Strength in numbers. We'll be able to hit harder if we're united." The group moved in silence, their faces grim as they navigated the rough terrain. The weight of their shared loss hung in the air like a storm cloud, but they had no time to dwell on it. They had to keep moving. They had to keep fighting. As they trekked through the desolate landscape, Elias's mind raced. The Federation's power was still a mystery. How far did their influence spread? How many planets were under their control? And what was their ultimate goal? Elias had learned through painful experience that answers didn't come easily in this new galaxy. The questions seemed to multiply the more they learned. After several hours of walking, they arrived at another settlement. This one a little larger than the last. It was quiet, almost eerily so. As they approached, they saw a few figures moving about in the shadows, their faces hidden beneath hoods. The people here seemed just as wary, just as mistrustful, as the ones in the last settlement. Survival had made them all cautious, and Elias knew they would have to be careful if they hoped to gain anything from this place. Elias stepped forward. The others closed behind him. "We're looking for information," he called out, his voice projecting but steady. "We're survivors, just like you. We need to know what happened. We need to know what the Federation has been doing and where their forces are concentrated." There was a long pause, and then a man stepped out from behind a building, his face shadowed. He looked them over carefully before speaking. "You're asking the right questions, but you're asking the wrong people," he said, his voice rough, as if it had been a long time since he had spoken to anyone. "The Federation doesn't care about small colonies like ours. They're not interested in the outlying systems. But there's talk. There's always talk." "What kind of talk?" Elias asked, his patience wearing thin. "Talk of a resistance," the man said, his eyes glancing nervously over his shoulder. "People in the shadows, fighting back. They're harder to find than a needle in a haystack, but they're out there. The Federation's been hunting them for years, but they keep slipping through the cracks. Where can we find them?" Tarek asked quickly, stepping forward. The man hesitated. "You don't find them. They find you. They don't trust easily, and if you're not careful, you'll end up dead." "Tell us where we can look," Elias pressed, not willing to let this opportunity slip away. "If there's a resistance, we need to join them. We need to fight back." The man nodded slowly, then gave a small, knowing smile. "There's an old space station on the edge of the rim. It's abandoned, or so it seems. But if you know how to look, you might find a way in. Just don't expect any help from me. I've seen too many die trying to fight back." "Thanks," Elias said, already turning to leave. "We'll find it." As they left the settlement, Elias's heart was racing. A resistance. This was the opportunity they had been looking for. It was their chance to find allies, to gather strength, to take back control of their destiny. But it wouldn't be easy. Nothing ever was. They would have to tread carefully, make sure they didn't get caught in the Federation's ever-watchful eye. "Let's move out," Elias said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "We head for the space station. It's a long shot, but it's all we've got." The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with dangers and unknowns. But Elias had made up his mind. They would fight. They would survive. And together, they would reclaim what had been taken from them. No longer just survivors, they were becoming something more. They were becoming a force, and the Federation would soon learn that they hadn't seen the last of them.